So now I'm going to move on to walking through the school-to-prison pipeline. So we finally get to the school-to-prison pipeline, right? And I'm going to walk through it, through the story of two little boys and their moms, okay? So this is a Prezi. It gets way bigger. You're not expected to be able to read that little tiny, tiny, tiny font. But this is the school-to-prison/immigrant detention pipeline. Okay. Up at the top, I'm bringing up the age spans, because this is going to be a life course model, right? So you start 0 to 4, 5 to 11, 12 to 17 years old, 18 to 24, and then 25 and up. Okay? If you think about what the school-to-prison pipeline is, it's a handoff of responsibility for children across institutions, and then eventually adults. So we begin life in the most important institution, which is the family, right? And what we know, again, because of changes in the labor market, is very, very quickly, what do we hand off to? Childcare, right? Childcare and preschool hand off to elementary school and secondary school. What's changed is elementary and secondary school have increasingly, either indirectly or directly, begun to hand off to the police. The police hand off to the juvenile court and juvenile justice system. The juvenile justice system then creates a slide path to jail, prison, and then, very importantly, the experience of having a felony record in this country and what that means. And then finally, it goes from one generation to the next. So let's begin at the beginning. 2 mamas and 2 babies, right? And remember, we talked about what neighborhood and community was like. So remember the environment that this mama and baby, these 2 families are in. How many people have ever heard of the concept of toxic stress? Okay, good. We got some folks out there. So stress is important. We need stress to grow. That's why you lift weights, right? You know, stress gets you to perform well. Too much stress, though, is toxic to your system. Okay, and what do we mean by that? So we have a stress response system. The core piece of it is this part in our brain, one on either side. It's almond-shaped component called the amygdala. Okay, the amygdala is like the fire alarm of the brain. Okay, so it's basically when it smells a little bit of smoke, thinks we're in danger in any ways, it goes off, bing, 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 and it bathes our body in stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, gets our heart beating fast, right? It shuts down everything that it doesn't need. You don't need to be reproducing, right? You don't need to be doing higher thinking. It shuts all of those down. It gets you ready to do one of 3 things: fight, flight, or play dead, okay? That's it. It is a survival mechanism, and it is a brilliant survival mechanism. It has kept us alive beautifully. But remember the context it was designed for, right? It was designed for a context in a world where every now and then the tiger would jump out the bushes. And you would need your amygdala to go on, and it would get your body ready, and you'd run as fast as you possibly can, and within a couple milliseconds you either get away, right, or you don't, right? In both cases, the stress response stops. Okay? If you get away, your body will go and reset itself. Okay? It goes from fight and flight to rest and digest, right? If you get caught, then you're eaten, and that's it. Right? Now the problem is, for this mama and baby, when you're living in these neighborhoods, it's like the tiger is always chasing you. The tiger is always chasing you. You can't get away from it. And the thing is, we weren't designed to have the stress response system on all the time. We weren't. In fact, cortisol is toxic to the brain. That's the stress hormone. It's toxic to the body. Literally staying in this toxic stress space for years and years takes years off your life. Literally, you live less. It's toxic to your organs. It physically degrades you, right? It's especially dangerous for babies' brains, right? Because remember, we come into the world kind of half-baked, right? We still got a lot of, anyone who's had kids, you know the first 5 weeks are like nothing that you've ever experienced, right? But really the first 3 months it's kind of like, I remember thinking, oh, this little creature really was meant to be inside still. And a lot of times they call it the 4th trimester, right? But we gotta get out. We got giant heads. Our big thing is our brain, right? We gotta get out. So a lot of the development happens outside the womb, right? And it happens through this intense interaction with your environment, in particular with your mom, right? Or with your grandma, or with your guardian, or with your dad. Whoever is that main person taking care of you. It's that back and forth, the goo-goo gaga, all of that stuff they called serve and return. All of it's building the brain, building all the different parts of the brain. The problem is, if the baby is in stress response, right? If there's violence, fighting, frightening things happening, then only one part of the baby's brain is on, that stress response system. And the brain's like a muscle. Only one part is exercising. Only one part's getting stronger and stronger. That's this hypervigilant fight or flight piece, okay? And what isn't developing is the prefrontal cortex. What is the prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain? What is it responsible for? Higher order thinking. Other things? Personality. Other things? Decisions. Decision making, executive function, right? Self-regulation, planning, right? Okay? It's a really amazing thing. It's the slow thinking part of us, though, and you don't need it when you're in danger. But babies really need to, children need to exercise that part of their brain, right? What this means is that by the time this child reaches 3 years old, they have significant developmental delays, okay? By the time they reach 5 years old, they have big developmental delays. Now, here's the question for you. A lot of us grew up in those environments. You know, and we have our brothers and sisters, and we have all of our neighbors. I've seen tons of folks who grew up in these neighborhoods, and most of us don't have developmental delays. Most of us are totally okay. We're good. Thriving and resilience is the rule, not the exception. But why is that if we have all this science that this environment does this to our brains? What's going on? How come most of us are okay? And the reason is because we have something that is as good as an antidote to toxic stress. What is that? What is the antidote? What is the big protector from toxic stress?
I would say it's attachment to, and I think at least one mediating figure in that child's environment. So just one person that they can count on to get the type of attachment, the benefits of attachment.
Thank you, sir. You're the first person who's answered the right thing right off the bat in all the time I've done this. You know what that is? That was amazing. It's the antidote is love. The antidote is love. It's what in the scientific literature is called secure attachment, right? Let me tell you, that person, whether it's the grandma or the dad or the mom, what they do is they create this amazing bubble of protection around the baby, okay? And that bubble keeps all that toxic stress out, okay? It's so powerful, in fact, that when you talk about how we define trauma and toxic stress, we define toxic stress as terrible things happening in the absence of supportive relationships, right? So it's the relationship that protects and heals. And that's great for all of the babies whose mamas are doing that, but who's protecting the mom? Could be her mama, could be an auntie, could be a lot of folks in the family, could be the community. The fact is, in a lot of these neighborhoods, there's violence, but there's also incredible love and power and resilience and caring beyond what you can imagine and faith beyond what you can imagine. And that helps to protect them. But we also need to remember, in these neighborhoods, most people have been there multiple generations. Okay? They've lived in these conditions across generations. A study looking at the poorest neighborhoods in the US found that 70% of the people in there, their ancestors were living in those same neighborhoods in 1970. See what I'm saying? You're stuck in this. And when you're stuck and when you're exposed to all of that over generations, a lot of your support system breaks down, right? Maybe your mama isn't there anymore. Maybe your sisters are locked up. Maybe your brother's locked up. But the grief accumulates. This powerful, powerful grief of loss. And sometimes it gets so heavy that mamas break. What does it look like when mamas break? What does a broken mama look like? Depression, I can't even get out of bed to get my kids dressed and to school. Drug use, right? That's alcohol, being stuck in abusive relationships, right? All of that. When mamas break, there's nobody to protect the baby, and the baby is exposed to toxic stress. So for the kids whose mamas break, they end up delayed. So these little boys turn 5 years old and they go to kindergarten, okay? Now we have one mama who broke, okay, and is suffering. The other mama is, again, more the rule, but she's that protector mama. You know that mama, right? She's got a million bubbles, right? She goes to so many lengths to take care and to protect her child and to prepare her child for what's ahead, right? So you got 2 5-year-old boys, and these are 2 black or brown 5-year-old boys, okay? But one of them has been protected. So one of them is just completely a normally developing 5-year-old boy. So what are 5-year-old boys like? Active, energetic. Are they particularly good at, like, are they going to come in really school ready? Like, are they going to be able to sit in a circle and keep their hands to themselves? Are they going to be able to color in the lines? Are they going to, like, not just, like, collapse into their friends' life? No, the thing is, kindergarten through 2nd grade is essentially an apprenticeship time for them. They're going to go through an intense apprenticeship with an adult, and they're going to learn how to be a student. So by the time they're in the 3rd grade, they've got those skills. Boys, on average, are going to be behind girls. In a lot of these, there's a developmental lag that doesn't close till about 7, right? So the normal boy needs that person right near. And how do normal kids learn, right? What they learn. No, we don't do that. This is how we do it, redirect. No, we don't do that. This is how we do it, redirect. And you do it in 7,632 times, and then suddenly on the 7,633 times, they get it, right? Don't you? And then you're like, and then they have it forever. And you're just like, what the, right? So that's how they learn. But I'm going to say, because this little boy with the protector mom is black, he's not going to get that privilege of childhood. He's not going to get that because we know, because of implicit bias, who's the person who brought up implicit bias? Right here, thank you. We know that because of implicit bias, his behavior is going to be seen as more aggressive and more dangerous and punished more severely because he's black, okay? What do we know? A study out of Stanford. They recruited teachers off the website, right? And it was one of those, a social psychology study, so you come in, you get randomized to 2 groups. But basically, this is the rigmarole. They give you a school discipline record from a real school, a middle school in California, right? And you read it, and in it is the story of a boy who was doing, remember the boy with the Kleenex? Picking up the, they, like doing irritating things like that. Like misbehavior that's disrespectful and distracting. Is his behavior interfering with everyone's learning? Absolutely. Like, it's so silly when they say no. Of course. It's eating up the teacher's time. It's a pain. So they do this, and then they say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, tell me how irritated were you? How much did that interfere with your ability to keep order in class? How severe was this? And then finally, what kind of punishment do you think this child should get? You go through that whole thing, and then they go, uh-oh, 2 weeks later, he does it again. And there he is doing the same thing with the tissues and the garbage can, and, so you have to go through okay, now, how irritated are you? Now, how much did it interfere with your ability to keep order in the classroom? How severe did you think it was? And what kind of punishment? Okay, so what was the trick? Because there's always a trick in these, right? You got randomized to 1 or 2 groups. The trick was the stories were exactly the same, the name was different. In one, it was Darnell or Deshaun, and the other one, it was Greg or Josh. Okay? So for one group, the treatment group, you had a name that was identifiably African American. That's the only difference. Okay? So what did they find? Well, they compared the 2 groups. Well, after the first, minor act of disobedience, right? No difference. It's really great findings. Doesn't matter if it was Greg or Darnell, right? Teachers are the same amount irritated. They say it interferes in the same way with their teaching, right? They find it equally severe, and they recommend the same discipline. Totally the same. It's after the second offense. It's the repetition when things change. You get what's called, the authors call the black escalation effect. Essentially, Greg and Josh, they just stay exactly the same. You don't get more irritated. You don't find it more severe. You don't, recommend harsher discipline. But for Darnell or Deshaun, wow, it goes up. The title of the research article is 2 strikes and you're out, right? Suddenly, for Darnell and Deshaun, remember, it's the exact same story, right? Teachers find it more irritating. They say it interferes with their ability to keep order. It's a more severe, and here's the kicker. They recommend harsher discipline. Yeah, they also are more likely to say that they think it's part of a pattern and to label the child a troublemaker. Okay? Essentially, this is happening not because of explicit racism. In the survey they do, of course, they have all these instruments and all these, they basically test people for explicit racism, but they also test them for implicit bias. They screen out the explicit stuff. What's happening is happening underneath consciousness, right? Underneath consciousness because of all of the message we get, right? But what it does is it deprives black children of a chance to be children, right? The interesting thing, though, is teachers of every race did this. The black teachers did it just as much as the white teachers, and the Latino teachers did it just as much. Everyone was doing it. So that boy from this neighborhood who's got his protector mom is still going to end up in the principal's office. Oh, but what about the boy without the protector mom? Oh no, things are going to go wildly wrong, really fast, right? Because if you think about it, you can have a 5-year-old with real serious delays, 5-year-old who's going to come into the class acting more like a 3-year-old. And what are 3-year-olds like? They're demanding, and they're crazy, and they're violent. There's a study, the research, I'm serious, this is for real. They did a study, a peer-reviewed study of when is the height of violence across the age span. 3 years old. It was the most hitting, the most, right? When my boys were 3, we just no, sweetie, you can't play with that truck anymore. And the child would take it and hit me in the face with it. And I had a lot of craziness in my life, so I have a certain type of reaction when someone does that, right? And I look at him and I'm just like, what are you thinking? I'm your mother. You're gonna die without, you need me. What are you thinking? The issue is, they're not thinking. When you're 3 years old, that part of your brain isn't on yet. You have no ability to control those impulses. Now, unfortunately, this 5-year-old is gonna act like that. So think about how that child's gonna be seen by the teacher and by the other kids in that class. Really quickly, both boys are gonna have conflict, and because things have changed, they're gonna get an office referral, and then end up in the principal's office. And it's very likely that they will end up suspended. So what happens when you get suspended? What do you get less of? You get less learning time, right? Around someone trained to teach you and other kids there to learn, right? And it shouldn't be too surprising that if you get less learning time, you fall behind, right? And you become disengaged, right? So the problem is, we know causality goes both ways, right? So we know also that kids who are behind to begin with, right, and disengaged, are also more likely to act out and be suspended, right? So it works both ways. The problem was we needed research that showed that the suspension route, the suspensions were doing independent harm, right? It wasn't just the fact the kids who were already behind and were going to drop out anyway got suspended. So they did a study at Texas with 5 million fifth graders, I'm serious, that they followed into their early 20s. Every fifth grader there. And Texas very early adopted unique identifiers in its data, allowed them to match data sets. What this allowed them to do was this pretty amazing thing. Basically, statistically, they took a 7th grader, right? Let's say you take a 7th grade boy, they match him with another 7th grade boy. Same race, parents with same education, same rural, urban, same size school, same number of certificated teachers. They were able to match on 80 variables. They were able to match on disciplinary history. How many times that kid? test scores, grades, okay? So they tried to match on everything. So you got these two kids who are the same. The only difference is one gets suspended out of school. And then they followed them. And what did they find? They found that the kid who was suspended was twice as likely to have to repeat a grade compared to the kid just like him, but who didn't get suspended. And that the kid who was suspended was twice as likely to drop out of high school compared to the kid with the same grades, the same test scores, who didn't get suspended. So tell me then, what do you get more of when you get suspended? Free time, right? So now when you're little, you know, someone's gonna need to come and get you, right? They're not gonna send like the second grade home, right? But remember the jobs people have. They don't have that flexibility in their jobs. If they take it, they're liable to get fired, right? So what you're going to be doing is hustling and calling up auntie and sisters and cousins and everyone you can think of to come get that child. And as soon as you can leave them alone without ending up with a CPS case, you're going to do it. So very soon the kid's going to be home, playing video games, eating hot Cheetos, right? You know? Until they get bored out of their mind, and then they're going to go outside. Remember the neighborhoods these children live in. Remember what we talked about. Remember the community violence that they'll be exposed to. And remember the aggressive policing that's happening in those neighborhoods. So what happens is this increase in unsupervised time in poor, racially segregated neighborhoods leads to increased exposure to order maintenance policing and community violence. Okay. Does anyone know why Trayvon Martin, in the middle of a school day, was buying iced tea and Skittles? He'd been suspended from school. It was actually his third suspension. His first suspension was for being tardy. I've always wondered, why do you give kids a day off because they're late? It's beyond me. The second one is because he carved WTF in a locker. And the third one, they were doing searches of everyone's backpack. They found an empty Ziploc bag in his backpack, and they said they tested it, and it was positive for marijuana residue. Okay. He got a 10-day suspension, okay, 2 weeks. Now, his mom and dad were divorced. His mom was nervous, right, about him staying alone at her place. So she sent him to his father's gated community so he would be safe. And he ended up the victim of community violence. For those who don't have somebody with gated communities, it's going to be very likely that you're going to end up arrested. And in fact, the study out of Texas, the 5 million fifth grade study, not only were the kids twice as likely to be held back and drop out, the kid who was suspended was 3 times as likely as the kid just like him to be in the juvenile justice database. Okay, so this isn't like self-report, this is their name pops up, right? So it basically tripled the likelihood of contact with the juvenile justice system. The truth is, though, that's the traditional route, right? You get pushed out of school, you're on the street, and you end up arrested. But over the last 40 years, things have changed such that you don't even need to be pushed out, right? Because there's been an explosion of police in school. What does that mean? That means that you can be arrested directly from school, okay? Now the problem with there are so many amazing school resource officers, like who are in it for the right reasons. The problem is there's a terrible developmental mismatch between a policeman's job and a teenager's job, right? Policeman has a sworn duty to enforce the law, okay? What's a teenager's job? To be a pain in the butt. Because remember the bubble? The beautiful bubble of protection? Well, that child better start to get out of that bubble, right? Because they're practicing independence. And you practice independence by pushing back. And teachers and people in schools understand that. They understand it's a teaching moment, you need to have good boundaries, there need to be consequences, right? But they also know it's what teenagers do. The problem is, in the presence of a police officer, this same developmentally appropriate behavior becomes resisting arrest, becomes an arrestable offense, not following the orders of a sworn police officer, right? So that's the danger. If you get arrested enough, you're going to end up in juvenile court, you end up in juvenile court enough, you're going to end up in what we call secure confinement, right? Secure confinement is like kids' prison or jail, right? Okay. And when you end up locked up, it's like it snaps your connection to school. So first, I'm not sure how it is in Ohio, so correct me if I'm wrong, but in most states, you go into a different school district if you get locked up, right? Like there'll be a different, like in California, it's the county office of ed that does all of the juvenile court schools, right? So you're in a different one. And then when you come back, you need to re-enroll, okay? You need to get back in. And that can be notoriously hard because now you got a mark on you, right? So in LA, young people will go from school to school in areas where they have a decentralized enrollment process and be refused entry. Because remember the principal back there in the standards-based reform who was freaking out about how to raise the test scores? Well, it's completely rational. The last thing they're going to want is a kid who just got out of juvie, right? So they're pushing back. They're pushing back. Kids will spend 6 to 7 months not being able to access a school. And when they do, what kind of school is it going to be? It's going to be an alternative school. And this is the problem. By the time you hit this place in the pipeline, you need help. Okay? It's no more like, hey, let's try to build your social emotional muscle. Oh, this is a normally developing 5-year-old. Oh, something's going on with his family. We need wraparound services. Now you're behind, you've been locked up. Like this says, your probability of dropping out has gone from a 1 in 10 to a 1 in 4 chance because of being incarcerated. Just at the time when you need more grown-up time, you need more connections with adults, you're going to be put in a school which has structurally less time, where you're going to be given packets, independent study packets, that are stapled that you bring home and you do on your own. You're going to be put in front of a computer to do very low-quality credit recovery. Often there are less seat time requirements in these schools. So right when you need more relationship, you get less. So let's say you get back in, you're in the alternative school, you're sitting there in the back of the classroom, and you're wearing your cap, and the teacher says, Miss So-and-so, take off your cap. Well, first, before we get there, how do you think the young person's feeling right now? Are they feeling like the world's a pretty fair, safe place at this point? What do you think? No. They probably have what we call in social science a chip on their shoulder. Right? They're going to feel like the world is pretty unfair, right? They're going to be, so there they are in their alternative ed class, and they're sitting there, and the teacher says, take off your hat. Do you think this young person, in response to that order, is going to escalate or de-escalate? And then what's going to happen? They're going to get suspended from school. And so this is the first of a number of negative feedback loops. They get locked in there, right? And you go round and round, such that by the time you're 18, it's very likely that a couple really terrible things have happened, and one is that you've dropped out of school. And we know that dropping out of high school doubles to quadruples the probability of going to prison. This is particularly intense for black men, okay? Nationally, almost 70% of black men without a high school degree, by the time they're in their late 30s, early 40s, have been to prison. And that's just state and federal prison. That doesn't count jail. In California, it's 90%. A near certainty. The next thing is it's going to be quite certain that you've been locked up, okay? You've been locked up in the juvenile system. The other thing that the juvenile system does is that it doesn't just break the connect to school. It also builds a slide pathway to the adult system, okay? So this is a study out of Chicago. And in Chicago, how the juvenile court works is they basically assign all of the judges randomly. So the docket is random, right? And so us researchers, we love it when that kind of stuff happens, right? Because it's a great way to do a quasi-experimental study. What it allowed them to do, they're able to take all the kids in juvenile court, and they're able to match all of their CPS, their not Child Protective, but Chicago Public Schools data, right? So they had all of this information on the kids. What it allowed them to do was to compare two kids who were the same on everything. The only difference was the judge they got. Now, why did that matter? It matters because judges have relatively consistent probabilities of locking you up or not locking you up. In other words, there are jailer judges And there are non-jailer judges. We all know how important it is the judge you get, right? You look, oh, it's going to be okay, right? So what they were able to do was to compare the outcomes of the kids who got the jailer judges to the kids who got the non-jailer judges, okay? So they weren't even, so all they were doing were comparing kids who had a higher probability of being locked up, right? This is what they found. The kids who got the jailer judges, compared to the kids just like them in the system, right, who got a more lenient judge, right, the likelihood of going to prison by their early 20s increased by 22 percentage points. And again, they looked for their names in the Illinois State database. So that's like to increase 22 percentage points is enormous. Not 22%, 22 percentage points. That's like going from a 1 in 10 chance to a 1 in 3 chance. What happens after that is you bounce around in jail until you get a felony, right? You get a felony and that will send you to state or federal prison. What happens, though, if you are undocumented, if you don't have papers, and you end up with a felony? What's going to happen to you? You're deported, right? And what happens before you're deported? You're detained. What's immigrant detention? It's immigrant jail. It's the same thing. The same for-profit companies that run our state prisons also run our detention centers. They're the same thing. And since 1996, immigration detention has increased by 500%. Now, what happens if you get this felony, though? You got all your stuff in order. You got a green card. You're a legal permanent resident. You've done it by the books. You got it all okay. What happens to you? You get deported. You get detained and deported. In 1996, 2 years after the crime bill, we passed a bill called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Bill that basically stripped legal permanent residents of all their due process rights. And you just lose it. You could have been here 30, 40 years. All you had done is not done the citizenship. You hadn't taken the citizenship. And you will go back.
Excuse me.
Yeah?
Could you repeat the name of that bill?
Oh, sure. It's called ADEPA. It's the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. I was like, what's the final A? I was like, association? No, that's all wrong. Okay, so, and also, if you happen to be in a place where your local law enforcement is working with ICE, the immigration enforcement folks, you don't even have to be convicted of a felony, right? It could be a broken tail light. It could be you were pulled over and your number was run. It comes up and an ICE hold is put on you, right? But let's talk about the folks who stay home here, the domestic prisons. At this point in the pipeline, things are dire, okay? So listen, you've been asking for help for years, since you were a kindergartner. And how do young people ask for help? They act like, oh, they drive us crazy, right? And the problem is, every time you acted out, when you repeated it, when it got more intense, instead of taking you in and saying, we got to do something about this, right? Instead of increasing relationship, instead of requiring mentoring, we pushed you away and out into the street, right? This means that what in elementary school or middle school or high school would have been like, would have been early intervention, right? We would have called it early intervention. We say, well, I need a therapist so they can work on this, or the wraparound services, or we can do this. It has metastasized by this time. And what were these treatable issues now are behavioral health issues, okay? They've metastasized into substance abuse and serious mental illness. So by the time you get there, in prison, about 53% of people in prison have a serious substance abuse issue. 56% have a mental health problem. When you combine them, it's about 2 out of 3. And then once you get to prison, it's going to make you sicker, okay? So this is research out of Nashville. Each additional year in prison produces a 2-year decline in life expectancy, okay? So does anyone know can anyone guess what that's a picture of? Processing? Other guesses? Segregation. This is Mule Creek State Prison in California. This is group therapy. You finally got a therapist! We've been wanting you to get there. Do you think this is going to work? No. And in fact, this prison was sued for the quality of its health care, right? And is currently under a settlement agreement. If you survive all that and you get out, the hard part is in a certain way, your punishment have just begun. Why is that? Because once you come out with that felony, having that criminal history makes all of the old forms of discrimination that our ancestors fought and died for legal. Voting, education, housing, benefits. You can deny those to someone based on their criminal history, and it is entirely legal. In fact, in certain cases, we mandate it, right? The other thing is you're going to come out facing all that legal discrimination, and you'll likely also come out in debt, right? Why are you going to be in debt? Child support arrears, fines and fees, restitution. So you have kids, which by your early 20s, mid-20s, most of these young people will have children, right? Your child care debt runs while you're in there, okay? It runs. Y'all have done some amazing work over here, beginning to change those rules in powerful ways. Still, what's happening in most states is it's running, you get out, and now remember, you don't owe this money to the kid. You owe the money to the state, because the state's been paying welfare. So now, if you get a job, guess what they're going to do? They're going to take your wages. So it's not going to be surprising that someone facing legal discrimination and enormous, basically, debt, that this is going to increase the probability of low earnings, housing instability, and untreated health problems. And if you're homeless, jobless, and sick, what is that going to increase the probability of? You going to recidivate or reoffend. And this is the second negative feedback loop you're caught in. I call them systems traps. You circle and circle and circle until finally it moves from one generation to the next. This is a study of exactly the group we're talking about. People who committed a felony, convicted of a felony, and didn't have high school degrees. It looks at what happens 20 years after you're released from prison. This is what they found. 75% remained in the bottom 20% of income distribution. Now, over the course of 20 years, you usually see growth. What happens is it essentially stops social mobility. It stalls. So a felony conviction stalls social mobility. It's like what it does if you think there's like a floor where you are and you want to climb up the ladder to get to where life's better, right? What it does is it makes the floor really sticky, and then it knocks out the early bars. So you're trying to get up there, but you can't, the rungs are gone, right? And if you're stuck there, who's stuck there with you? Your babies. When you were stuck at the bottom, so were your children. And hence, disadvantage passes to the next generation. Now, all of these, every single one of these circles is backed by dozens and dozens of research studies. But there is nothing on this that has more research and more evidence than this piece. We know a lot about the children of incarcerated parents. And what do we know? We know that the children of incarcerated parents, especially boys, are more likely to display externalizing behavior. What's externalizing behavior? It's acting out. It's aggressive behavior. And what happens when little boys who display externalizing behavior in the classroom? They get suspended from school. This is the intergenerational loop. And let's talk about, have people here heard about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences? Okay, cool, awesome. So these are bad things that happen as a child that basically are as powerful as predicting disease and lifespan as smoking or obesity, right? The more you have of them, the shorter your life, the sicker you get. This baby, as soon as they're born, they probably have 3. Right? Okay? Having a parent who's incarcerated, having a parent suffering from mental illness, and have a parent suffering from substance abuse. Now, these ACEs, the adverse childhood experience, they predict morbidity and mortality. They're also the most powerful predictors of being a victim or perpetrator of violence, right? So what is this also recreating? This is feeding back into that community violence. This is feeding back into the next generation of family violence. This, in sum, is the school to prison pipeline.